Welcome, 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 good people. Welcome to day 15 of our 28-day ancestral activation for Black liberation. Thank you so much for being here. We have gone through 2 weeks of working with and calling on our ancestors and learning from them every single day in Blackity Black History Month. And I'm just so thankful to be here and thankful that you all are here. So today on day 15, we begin our third week where we activate and work with ancestors who are in our sacred resistance realm. These are the ones who, in their own way, who resisted oppression, who resisted the flavor of oppression that was happening during their times with using their own unique gifts. And, as we can see from this, what you see on the screen and what was in the thumbnail, sometimes and oftentimes it resulted in not being in the favor of law enforcement or government officials, but they stood by what was right and did what was right. And so that's what we're talking about this week. And today in particular, we're talking about who can be a little known civil rights figure, Robert Williams, Robert F. Williams to be exact. So we'll dive into what what he did, how he resisted, what his stance was, and what wisdom and legacy he's left behind for us. So if that's your jam, if that's your something that you want to tap into, definitely click like, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you know when we go live. And like I've said every day, let that bell notification that we're going live be your reminder to check in with yourself, to check in with your higher spirit, to check in with your ancestors, whatever your spiritual practices align you with. This entire series is about our ancestors. Um, and so hopefully you are doing that, but let that be a reminder to you to just check in and so that you can get your guidance direct from your people. And so who am I? I am Barbara Ohuninifa. Let me take a pause and just say too, thank you for your grace. I am off camera today. If you've been following along and been with us daily, I started this pretty much, almost halfway through the first week of doing every other day on and off camera. I am managing health conditions and the energy goes up and down. And, I kind of need the days off camera so that I can keep producing this work and keep showing up. Consistency is what's key. So I thank you for your grace in that I'm not on camera, but I am here with you. So with that, I am Barbara Ohuninifa. I am an author, a coach, and a speaker. And everything that I do, my entire reason for being on YouTube, for writing the books that I write, coaching the women that I coach, speaking at events that I speak at, everything that I do is in alignment with the mission of helping Black women to recognize that we are beautiful, remember that we are powerful, and to be love, to be the love that we give to others, to be the love that we seek from others, to simply be the love and let our cups overfill and let everyone else bask off of that overfilling. And so I thank you for being here. And this ancestral activation is not only for Black women, it is for all of us who understand and recognize the times that we are in and want to get closer to our ancestors, to tap into that wisdom, to tap into their lived experiences that honestly lives within us. But we have to open ourselves to understanding it and to activating that wisdom because they're always with us. Our loving ancestors who we worked with the first week in our sacred lineage. We worked with our actual blood relatives, our blood ancestors. And, if you were adopted or fostered, those relatives that you felt close to, those people who raised you, those who loved you, your chosen family, and or tapping into the blood family, even though you may not have known them, they are still your ancestors. And it may not have felt like it in this life, but they still loved you and wanted to be close to you. And so that's what we did the first week in different ways. Each day we went through a different aspect of the sacred lineage and how to work with and connect with our own blood relatives. And then in week two, last week, we went into sacred shields. We started working with community ancestors and honoring community ancestors who did work that allowed us to tap into the wisdom so that we could secure our foundations to even be able to go forward towards liberation. Foundational things like having the financial resources that we needed, having strategy that we needed, having the health that we needed, knowing what foods are actually good for us, what foods are actually beneficial to us, so that we can structure our lives and have the resources and have the things that we need so that we can think clearly and look ahead and strategize and forecast where to go and how to get there. And so we worked with a number of different ancestors last week, and we ended that second week yesterday, diving into the incredible things that our collective ancestors did in Black Wall Street in Tulsa, the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We also talked about what happened and how that incredible community was destroyed through state sanctioned violence. And that led us into today of talking about sacred resistance. Because when we think about, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, when we think about how the coordinated attack was made on that district with the first aerial terrorism, dropping bombs and firing from airplanes on these citizens. That was the first aerial terrorist attack on U.S. soil was against the Black entrepreneurs and families in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So, yes, we need to rebuild. And I talked about a number of the things that we can consider in terms of our way forward to revive the economic empowerment and sovereignty that we had created for ourselves in that Black Wall Street. And part of it is self-defense. And that is what Robert Williams was all about. That was his philosophy, that was his ethos, if you would. So we'll talk about him and we're going to get into him now. A couple of housekeeping notes I just wanted to make as well. As we move into the sacred resistance this week, we are working with a number of different ancestors who, again, as I mentioned, resisted in their own ways. And rather than have a guided meditation for each one, guided meditation and prayer and activation, after we honor them for each one, I'm going to record an extended guided meditation that you can use at any point that really encompasses the theme of the week and all of the lessons and wisdom which are really around courage and love. That's the consistent theme through all of these ancestors that we're working with this week. Because the idea of resistance can be controversial, it can be dangerous, it can be, um, eh, but it can be dangerous and controversial, but it also should be very individual and how you show up and how you do that. So I wanted to remove and separate that guided meditation so that you can go internally and really work with yourself because tapping into your own internal love source and using that to fuel your courage takes a little bit more time and takes a little bit more delicate handling. So I wanted to do that separately. So once we go and understand and talk about what our ancestor Robert F. Williams has done, we'll end the session there. And then within the next 24 hours, potentially even later on today, I'll upload that guided meditation that you can use to really deepen the lessons, not only from Robert Williams, but from all of the ancestors that we'll work with during this sacred resistance. So just want to give you that housekeeping. And now let's get into it. I hope everyone is doing well. Are y'all love drunk? It's February 15th, right after Valentine's? Or are we still celebrating? It's self-love weekend. It's self-love month for the Black folks. You know what I'm saying? Blackity Black History Month is all about our ancestors. It's all about ourselves, all about love and loving ourselves unconditionally. It's also Heart Health Month, which I think is right in alignment with love, especially loving Black people, given that heart health is something we struggle with. But I digress. Let me get into this Robert F. Williams. And so, in terms of how he came about, if you will, we want to talk about the historical and social political landscape that he was born into. What's the context of the oppression? And the overarching theme when I look at his beginnings, his roots were he had a radical, or what was considered a radical response to white supremacist violence. And we'll talk about that as we go through it. So he was born in 1925. He actually was born in February. I think his birthday is the 26th, somewhere in there. But if you do a little research on him, you'll find that. Um, so we're celebrating his birthday coming up here. But he was born in Monroe, North Carolina, in the Jim Crow South. And that's where people, well, all across the South, people were systemically denied their rights and they faced economic and political disenfranchisement. And Monroe, in particular, was a stronghold for the Ku Klux Klan. They had frequent mob violence, cross burnings, and intimidation tactics that were just really aimed at keeping us oppressed economically and politically. And as a teenager, he worked in the local NAACP and he saw directly how legal appeals for justice were ignored. And it really reinforced his belief that Black people couldn't rely on the system for protection. And then the fact that he saw Black people killed, lynched, mutilated, brutalized without recourse, no justice, that fueled his belief that developed even stronger later on that Black self defense was the only way to go forward. Law enforcement in Monroe were they either ignored or actively supported the white mob violence, and it left Black families defenseless against these attacks, just getting slaughtered. And as a child, he saw this extreme violence at the hands of white mobs, beatings, attacks on neighborhoods without consequences for the perpetrators. And it changed him. It did a thing for him, or rather, it educated him on the realities. Now, his father was a badass. Sykes Williams, he was a proud, defiant man, and he didn't submit. He taught Robert Williams, he taught his grandson that Black people had a right to defend themselves, even if it meant taking up arms. And these acts of quiet defiance that his grandfather did, like he wouldn't bow his head, he would not, do the shucking and jiving and be submissive to white people. He stood his ground and stood who he was. And that showed Robert that submission was not the only path, but resistance was actually the only path in his philosophy to Black dignity and survival. And he personally experienced oppression, arrest, FBI surveillance. So when many Black men returned from World War II as veterans, they expected they were expected to accept racial subjugation after they had been out fighting for so-called democracy. And then he organized brought together those veterans and like himself and organized against those KKK attacks. And he gained national attention because of that and immediately grew scrutiny from white supremacists and the U.S. law enforcement. I mean, at that point, and in many ways now, are they different? He was arrested many times for his activism and was even accused of inciting riots, even though what he and his group did never initiated violence. They only responded to attacks and then was arrested for inciting a riots, even though they were just defending themselves. He was placed under, as I mentioned, under constant surveillance with J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. I was about to say CIA. I mean, again, is there a difference? They're not supposed to be on American soil. But anyway, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI considered him a national security threat. And he was under surveillance from the COINTELPRO operations, which targeted Black radical leaders for elimination and understand what that actually meant for elimination. And his belief in armed self-defense put him at odds even with other civil rights leaders who believed that nonviolence was the approach that was going to move them forward or move us forward. So then in 1961, and this is where the visual that was on the thumbnail and on the first slide of the FBI's most wanted for kidnapping. This is the story that that led to that. So he was falsely accused of kidnapping. So what happened was that year, Monroe was at the center of rising racial tensions due to all the civil rights protests and efforts to desegregate public pools and businesses. And it was, of course, met with the usual violent white resistance of their own. And Williams and his armed defense group that protected Black activists. And this is what was, I think, what was brilliant. There were the activists who did their nonviolent work, but groups like Williams and his team, his armed self-defense group, protected the activists while they did their work and protected them from being attacked and killed, including the Freedom Riders who had come to Monroe to challenge segregation. And I would say, I was trying to keep these focused. So there's so many terms here that we need to understand. So Freedom Riders was a group, and we'll hear more about it tomorrow when we talk about Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, about the Freedom Riders, because he was a part of that group too. But it's something to research and understand, because we got to understand our own history. So I'm not going to go too far into it here, but knowing that the Freedom Riders had come to Monroe as a part of this protest, as a part of this trying to desegregate the businesses and pools and whatnot in Monroe. And of course, violent opposition from the white mobs. And in one in particular, a white couple. And it's important to note that the Freedom Riders was intersectional. There was white people and Black people that were fighting, just like in the times of trying to emancipate or abolish slavery, there were white abolitionists and there were Black abolitionists as well. And so there was a white couple who was a part of the Freedom Riders who, trying to escape the violence that was going on from the white mob attacking all of the protesters and activists, had inadvertently entered a Black neighborhood, and Williams offered them refuge, offered them protection from all the chaos. Now, the couple, and they were, the couple knew they were there and on the by the grace of Williams, and were being protected and were kept safe. But regardless, he was still falsely accused of kidnapping them. They themselves didn't file charges. They themselves never said that they were kidnapped, and said, no, we weren't kidnapped. But he was still charged with kidnapping them, which is a serious charge in itself that could lead to execution. So they put a charge on him that could give them, again, state-sanctioned reason to unalive him. Now, he was facing imminent death, imminent arrest. So he fled the U.S. and sought asylum abroad, like many of activists did. He first went to Cuba, where he was granted protection by Fidel Castro and a platform to continue his advocacy through radio broadcasts and publications. Later, he traveled to China and North Vietnam, where he met with some anti-colonial movement leaders there. And while he was in exile, he continued to promote Black radical thought, linking the fight against racism in the U.S. to international liberation struggles. FBI continued to track him in exile, fearing his global Black revolutionary movements. And he became one of the first prominent Black American activists to internationalize the struggle for Black liberation. Pause on that for a minute. All because his grandfather taught him at an early age, and he saw firsthand that the systems that we were in were not going to protect us, and it was up to us to do it ourselves. So this was the foundation of his philosophy, the roots of where things started. So let's talk about his acts of resistance. And it really was around defending Black lives by any means necessary. So this is a visual of a book that he wrote in the 60s that you can still find. You got to search a little bit for it, but you can still find this book. And there was also a documentary created around that, which you can also find. Search a little bit, but where I found it, I haven't watched it yet, but it was quite interesting. I found it in a Black streaming service called Kwali TV um, that features all Black programming. Who knew? I didn't know. If y'all knew, y'all should have told me. But anyway, the documentary is there, and there's not a lot of places. It looks like it might be on Vimeo if you want to rent it or purchase it. but I just think the fact and access to that Black streaming service is really interesting, and you can tap into the documentary there. Um, and also to get the book. But let's talk about the things that he did. So he championed this armed self-defense approach as not only necessary, but the necessary moral response. Everything that was happening in the civil rights movement promoted nonviolent resistance, but he rejected that, and he said that we can't remain passive in the face of lynching and mob violence. Like there's no way you can't answer violence with violence was his view. And he argued that Black people had a fundamental right to protect themselves, their families, and their communities from attack. And he challenged this idea that Black liberation could come solely through moral appeals to white oppressors. Pause on that one. We see how well that's working out. The legal system actually has been weaponized. It was then and continues to be weaponized against Black self-defense. As we saw, if you defend yourself, they'll say you did something and still have a reason to kill you. I keep coming back to that quote that we mentioned in Zora Neale Hurston's day at in the earlier part of the Sacred Shields Week last week, when she said, we have to speak up about our pain or they'll kill us and say we liked it. I am probably butchering that quote, but that was the sentiment of what she said. And so understanding that he openly defied everything by arming his community. And he became the president of that Monroe chapter of NAACP in the 1950s and challenged those traditional nonviolent stands that the NAACP typically took. And again, encouraged Black people to arm themselves. He established a Black Armed Guard, or rather, the Black Armed Guard, which was a group of Black men, most of them World War II and Korean War veterans. And they organized patrols to protect Black neighborhoods from KKK attacks. Um, was it in Ohio most recently? A Black community has done something very similar, and they set up checkpoints when neo-Nazis tried to come there to harass them. They took up arms and created checkpoints and defended their communities. So I don't know if maybe they saw or saw this documentary, read the book, or just were aware of the actual history. And so his leadership in the NAAC transformed it from being a passive, or at least the Monroe NAACP, transformed it from being a passive organization into one that actively protected residents. And he believed in self-defense, but it wasn't about aggression, it was about survival. Now, he rejected these ideas of, I'm sorry, I'm looking through my notes just to make sure I'm on the right spot here. He rejected these ideas that we needed to submit. And he looked at, actually, I'm going to just build all of these because I think I built them in the wrong order. So right now I'm talking about this, how he engaged in both direct and indirect resistance and combining that armed self-defense. And I mentioned earlier, he had a radio program and a publication. So he combined these different approaches. Again, the armed self-defense with political activism and international advocacy, the fact that he traveled and sought asylum. So some of the direct action he took, armed patrols we talked about, and encouraging Black residents to take up arms and actively repel the KKK raids. This forced the supremacists, the white supremacists, to think twice before they attacked. He organized Black men to stand guard outside homes and churches, preventing arson and lynchings. And he gave public speeches and radio broadcasts that encouraged Black resistance and self-defense. This indirect action he took, again, using media and political writings. He wrote this book that I mentioned and that you see pictured here, Negroes with Guns. That was in 1962. It was a revolutionary book that actually influenced the Black Panther Party leaders like Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. and again made into a documentary, which you can see on the Kweli TV service. And in that, he said, there's no way to determine the sincerity of a person's words by listening to him speak. There is only one way, and that is to observe his actions. So while people talked about equality and all the things, they were allowing Black people to get slaughtered. Those actions meant more. And again, created a radical newspaper called The Crusader that spread his philosophy and documented racial injustice. Critical. Because as we can see now, they want to erase the history, and it's up to us to make sure that it is not current and past, because we're making history right now. And broadcast a Radio Free Dixie from Cuba, which was a radio show that that sent out revolutionary messages to Black Americans and exposed U.S. racism on a global scale. Um, he understood that armed self-defense, I'm all over the place with these, but he understood that armed self-defense worked best when it was combined with community organization, international awareness, and media strategy. He leveraged the legal right to bear arms, Second Amendment, also applied to Black Americans. So he didn't have illegal guns. Everything he had was through the system in terms of, the arsenal that he had. And the patrols that he advocated and created were mostly veterans who had military training, so they could organize defense squads and teach tactical protection. And he didn't operate in secrecy. He was overt and public about it. And his method was very similar to what the white oppressors wanted to do, which was to instill fear. In his case, it was to instill fear in the white supremacists that they needed to think twice before they came to try to unalive anybody in the Black community or terrorize anybody in the Black community. He was real open and overt about it. And when mainstream media ignored or misrepresented Black struggles, these publications that he created helped to amplify the resistance, helped to amplify the truth. And the time he spent abroad, again, internationalized the Black liberation struggle, connecting it with the struggle of other communities, other Black communities, other communities in the world that were positioning against colonialism and imperialism. And he challenged the U.S. legal system's racial treatment of Black children. There was a case where it was called the Kissing Case in 1958. So he was an advocate for these two little Black boys, age 7 and 9. These two boys, and later on in life, they actually were interviewed on the Oprah Winfrey Show. You can find a clip of it on YouTube. But they were 7 and 9 when they were arrested, beaten, and sentenced to reform school for years. So here's the story. These two little boys, James Thompson and David Simpson, were playing with some white kids while their grandmother was a domestic worker for the white family. So they were playing with some white kids, and at the end of the play dates, not really a play date, just kids playing outside, some of the white boys told the white girls, you should kiss them on the cheek before they go. So that's what one of the white girls did. She kissed both of these little Black boys on the cheek. Innocent, nothing salacious. When the little girl went home and told her mother, the idea of the story is that she just mentioned it casually. The mother was alarmed. She called the police. She said that these little boys had raped her daughter. And the boys were immediately arrested. They ran up on them, pulled out guns, arrested them, slammed them into the car door on the sides. You know how they do when they violently arrest us. Their parents weren't allowed to see them. They didn't see their mothers, their grandmother. They put them in jail, stripped them, beat them, said horrible things to them, abused them. It was about 6 days before they even went to court, quote unquote court. The white mobs in Monroe demanded extreme punishment. and used the case to enforce that even innocent interactions between Black boys and white girls were unacceptable. Now, mind you, the little girl kissed them and on the cheek. So Williams took up their case and he contacted national civil rights organizations, Eleanor Roosevelt, international human rights groups to expose it and continue to put pressure on the system. They had already taken these little boys and placed them into a reform school, which was basically just like the prison complex that we have now, was just another form of slavery. Now, he framed the case as part of the broader struggle against racial terror, arguing that even Black children were criminalized and brutalized under white supremacy. His advocacy led to global outrage, and after intense public pressure, the boys were eventually released. But if you watch that clip from the Oprah Winfrey Show about them, interviewing them, talking to those little boys now, or at that time, it was in the 1990s, who were grown men, that forever changed their lives. They had the stigma of being those little boys that raped a little girl, even though they never did. They didn't even know what that word meant. No one ever told them. They never understood what was happening to them and why. And it followed them for the rest of their lives. In and out of jail, because anytime anything went wrong, they just went looking for them. The police, the local police just went looking for them. But in terms of Williams and his fight for these little boys, it showed that his vision of self-defense wasn't just about guns. It was about defending the dignity and safety of Black people, including children. And mind you, he had two little boys of his own, so this hit home. This hit close to his heart in terms of being able to defend our people. Now, the fact that he introduced armed self-defense into mainstream civil rights challenged the idea that nonviolence was the only legitimate form of protest. He expanded the boundaries of the civil rights movements, making room for radical militant resistance alongside nonviolence. He paved the way for the Black Power movement, which later embraced his philosophy, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And by aligning Black liberation with global struggles against imperialism and colonialism, it helped shape this discourse on Black international and revolutionary solidarity. And the bottom line is his approach forced white supremacists to rethink their unchecked terror. If there wasn't going to be justice from those who were supposed to be in the business of justice, Black people were going to do it for themselves and protect themselves. If the Ku Klux Klan came to invoke terror, they were no longer certain that they were just going to do it and have a good old time about it and then go back home safely. And we thank Robert F. Williams for the innumerable lives that he saved by deterring violence and even returning violence when it showed up anyway. He redefined Black resistance. So let's talk about, I think it's important to look at the emotional and spiritual resilience of all of the people we're talking about this week. It's never about violence. It's never about how can we just invoke some type of revenge. There was a fire that sustained his fight. He relied on an unshakable belief that in our own dignity, in Black dignity, and the importance of resistance. He viewed self-defense as a moral and spiritual duty, that allowing Black people to be brutalized without resistance was an act of submission to white supremacy, and who are we to do that? He drew strength from his ancestors and the long history of Black resistance, the Black resistance from enslaved people who fought for freedom, and the radical traditions of the early 20th century. He drew from that strength and looked at the idea of submitting to white supremacy and allowing it to happen as being immoral. He developed this global consciousness, which we talked about, and even in exile, he never lost faith that he would one day return home. He continued to write, he continued to speak as if the struggle was far from over, and it wasn't. He saw strength in this collective action and revolutionary ideology and the knowledge that resistance was a necessary step towards liberation. He was committed to protecting Black lives, and that gave him purpose. He knew his work would mean future generations wouldn't have to fear and live in fear, or might not have to live in fear. Again, he had two little boys, and pictured here with him is his wife. Mabel Williams, she was ride or die. I don't know if that's where the term came from, but that's how she rocked. Him in exile, Cuba, all the places that he went, China, she was right there with him with their two boys. So he had strong family and community connections. And Mabel, in particular, who was as equally as committed as you can see in this picture, she ride with him. And that she and his family was a source of his strength and a source of why that they were his reason why. And he rejected fear as a weapon of control. He said that fear is a disease that eats away at the soul. And if a man is afraid to do what he believes is right, then he is already dead. That was a general summary of his philosophy. If you live in fear, you are already dead. It eats away at your soul. So, despite his exile and persecution, he never surrendered to despair or fear or sadness. He believed that history was going to be on the side of the oppressed and justice would eventually prevail, even if he had to be one that helped bring it about. And his philosophy of resistance was deeply influenced by ancestral defiance, communal resilience, and the global struggle for freedom. Again, coming back to his wife, she was a source of spiritual and emotional grounding for him, standing by his side through all the things, ensuring that their message of resistance endured even after his passing. He didn't necessarily follow a single religious tradition, but how he moved upheld ancestral and collective wisdom as a guiding force. And his belief in armed self-defense as a sacred duty, it made it a spiritual mission for him. And it mirrored much of what we're going to talk about later in this week, that for all of these freedom fighters that we'll talk about this week, what they did, the resistance that they enacted, their acts of resistance, the way they approached the oppressions of their time, the flavor of the oppressions of their times, was all sacred for them. And he saw Black community self-reliance as critical, whether it was through mutual aid, defending and taking care of each other, sharing a political vision. It was all a critical form of spiritual resistance, that solidarity. And then again, it's all founded on this profound love for Black people and his commitment to our survival and to our dignity. And when I think about that and really feel into that, the foundation that his grandfather set for him went a long way. This love, he was infused with love as a child, clearly, and heard these things in his home. You know, none of this is documented, but knowing what his ethos was, knowing his philosophy, knowing how he moved, and having been raised by a grandfather that did not bow, you know what was infused in him. And everything that he did, it wasn't about violence for the sake of violence or even retaliation. He simply believed in protecting Black life, not destroying white life. If they actually left them alone, he would leave them alone. But the white supremacists never did. So he protected Black life. And he loved his people enough to risk his own safety, knowing that without direct action, future generations would continue to suffer under racial terror. So he stood up and he took direct action. And his work went beyond self-preservation. He wanted to build a world where Black children could live without fear and Black families could thrive. The kissing case is an example of his passion in terms of supporting and protecting Black children. Again, thinking about the two sons of his own that he had. And he insisted that Black people had the right to exist with dignity and safety. And even in exile, he remained devoted, advocating for a world free of racial hierarchy, economic exploitation, and colonial control. So, from armed self-defense to Black power, what was his legacy? What was the impact that Robert Williams left? Robert F. Williams, we give thanks. He forced this national conversation on the right of Black people to defend ourselves. Mind you, Second Amendment, we had the right to bear arms. We also had the right to defend ourselves, and it challenged that dominant nonviolent narrative of the civil rights movement. And his leadership in Monroe proved that armed resistance could be effective. Many times when the mobs or the KKK showed up, there was a shootout and they had to retreat. Black lives were saved, homes were saved, people were saved. And his book, Negroes with Guns, was a foundational text for Black Power leaders later. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I already mentioned Huey P. Newton, the Black Panther Party. This was a text, and again, you can still find it. Search a little bit, but you can still find that book. And the fact that he was exiled, he went to Cuba, China, Korea. It exposed the U.S. government's hypocrisy while it claimed to champion democracy abroad, while persecuting Black leaders who simply demanded human rights right here at home. And that kissing case brought international embarrassment to the United States. And his advocacy helped radicalize the civil rights movement beyond and inclusive of nonviolent approaches. And his philosophy of armed self-defense directly influenced, as I mentioned, the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, leaders like Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and Malcolm X. They all read Negroes with Guns and saw the work he did as a blueprint for resistance. He inspired, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but he inspired Stokely Carmichael and inspired him to connect U.S. struggles with African and Third World, or rather the Global South, revolutionary movements. And the Deacons for Defense and Justice was a lesser known but critical armed defense group in Louisiana. And they cited Williams as an example for inspiring them to protect civil rights workers from KKK violence. He believed Black Americans should forge these global alliances and went on to actually start that process of doing that. His radical legacy and the groups that he created and the groups that he inspired, the legacy is often downplayed or sanitized and often even just erased. People prefer the more palatable version of civil rights movement, the nonviolent civil rights movements. They even downplay the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King, later, before he was assassinated, started to change his stance a bit. But we never, if you go and look into some archives of some of his speeches later, right before his assassination, his stance was starting to change. He and Malcolm X are starting to meet in the middle. It would have been a powerful force of blending of their philosophies and approaches. But let me keep going because y'all know I'll go off on a tangent. And again, that this philosophy of self-defense, the community organization, the international solidarity is still relevant as we think about anti-Black violence, the police brutality, the systemic oppression we see today. State violence against Black people continues. Police killings, criminalization of Black self-determination movements. And his argument was that Black people must be willing to protect themselves. And it is still an urgent conversation that we need to have and understand what that means. Now, the media still distorts and vilifies Black resistance. I keep having to pause because there's so much that has changed and gotten really worse and exposed to where much of what's happening in the media, you cannot even look at that as news. We're in different times now. You got to dig deeper and you got to find sources of information that actually speak truth. And they are not going to be mainstream media sources. The government still uses surveillance, exile, and legal repression to suppress radical Black activism, just like COINTELPRO and with the FBI back in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. There are modern equivalents that are much more covert, such as the monitoring of Black Lives Matter leaders and anyone else who speaks up. His global vision of Black liberation is more relevant now than ever with the current political and social and economic and legal climate that we are in. We are not exempt from any of what's happening. While the words immigrants and migrants and all of those words are used to make it seem like it's someone different than us, the laws that are being challenged now, the very Constitution is being challenged, and it very much affects the freedom of Black people. This is why it's important to understand the legal system, to understand politics, to understand these measures that are taking place, to understand the Constitution and the amendments. To roll back birthright citizenship puts Black people at risk. It took amendments to have us recognized as full human beings. It took amendments to have us be recognized to have rights equal to anyone else. If those amendments are taken away, what do you think is next? The work that Mr. Williams did is as relevant today as it was during his times. And the debate over gun rights and Black self-defense still persists today. The NRA is a thing. They have and the white supremacists use that fully, whether it's for school terrorism and all the things that they use, but it is also a path for Black people to bear arms as well. And, and I want to reiterate all this week, we're talking about Black freedom fighters, those who embodied sacred resistance in different ways. We're starting with this self-defense, this armed self-defense ancestor, Robert Williams, coming out of yesterday talking about the complete obliteration of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The coordinated militarized attack on citizens on U.S. soil, the first aerial attack on U.S. soil was done against Black people who were minding their Black business. So we're moving into this today and talking about Robert Williams because we have to understand the concept and look at the possibilities of needing to um, enact our own methods of self-defense. And I'm trying to be intentional with my words today. So let's move on to the lessons from his legacy and our ongoing fight for liberation. What can we learn from this ancestor? What's the ancestral wisdom that Robert F. Williams left behind for us? And here's a direct quote from the book slash documentary, Negroes with Guns, that came from him. And I think it's so powerful. I have asserted the right of Negroes to meet the violence of Ku Klux Klan with armed self-defense and have acted on it. So there's two parts to this. I want us to really understand words are important. He asserted the right. He recognized the right. He recognized and acknowledged that as Black people, we have the right to meet the violence that comes to us with armed self-defense. It was an intellectual standpoint. It was a decision. It was a clarity that he saw. He asserted this, and then he acted on it. So it didn't stay theoretical. It didn't stay as something that he thought about or they theorized or he talked about or, talked about at the barbershop. You know how we like to do. We talk about things and blah, 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 blah. But he acted on it. He organized. He brought people together. He trained people on how to use the firearms, how to set up perimeters. He and other veterans used their knowledge on how to protect our people. The knowledge that they gained fighting wars in other countries, supposedly for democracy, brought that same intelligence back to help us understand how to defend ourselves when we are literally behind enemy lines. So what's the wisdom? His approach to self-defense, community organization, and global solidarity is a blueprint for us. We don't need to ask for the right to live in dignity. We must take it. That was his standpoint. We can't depend on an unjust system to protect us. We got to defend ourselves. And his life was a testament to that. His life and what he did was a testament to that belief that he had. Freedom isn't given, it must be taken through action, courage, and self determination. So, this is a departure from civil rights movements at the time that, as we mentioned earlier, really tried to appeal to the moral integrity of white supremacists to change their minds, to do something different. He saw that that wasn't working and was like, we got to take a different tack. We got to do a different route. And acted on it. But we can't be afraid of resistance. And without a willingness to defend Black lives, systemic oppression would continue unchecked. So, this idea of self defense and gun rights, Black ownership, Black gun ownership movements are prevalent today. We'll need to name them. Some of them are probably covert, some are actually known. Maybe they're more for, for show, but we need to continue that legacy. Black people must be armed and trained, or at least trained to protect themselves on some level. His work also encourages us to reclaim this right to self-defense. It is not to say nonviolence and other tools and methods are not relevant, but we have to look at the full picture and understand what's happening and what has continued to happen to us. His community protection and mutual aid stance, he didn't advocate individual gun ownership for its own sake, to be clear. And he didn't advocate illegal gun ownership because then that just gives the system a reason to come for you. He believed in organized collective defense and training, understanding how to use the weapons, understanding how to protect yourself, as well as, it also has an impact in modern day grassroots networks, which we've talked about last week in the Sacred Shields in terms of the economic sovereignty and some of the things that those entrepreneurs did who became very wealthy. They used that wealth to fund bail systems. We know civil rights workers are going to get arrested. There were wealthy Black people who were at the ready to bail them out. It wasn't all necessarily fundraising. There were wealthy Black people that were funding the things covertly and quietly. Legal defense, as well as community-based safety programs. Like, we really have to look at, since desegregation and we've just kind of become spread out and not centralized, we really have to look at how we can start to really work together as a community to protect each other. And I mentioned this last week, and I think it bears repeating again. Actually, it may have been as recently as yesterday, that as we have been traumatized and impacted by these centuries upon centuries of terrorism, and it has, through epigenetics, impacted our bodies, impacted how we think, impacted our families, there's a level of healing that needs to take place so that we can show up as our actual indigenous community-based selves. Because too many of us, so many of us, take this individualistic route that has been pressed upon us by the dominant culture. And we got to let that go. It blocks us from being able to think about the idea and act on the idea of taking care of each other. So that's part of what needs to happen in order for us to really embody this community protection and mutual aid that we want to and need to move forward with. And then Black media and controlling our narrative, as we talked about, he knew the power of media control. He saw the propaganda that was going out on mainstream media, just like we see it now, and he created his own sources of information. The newspaper, the Crusader, the Radio Free Dixie that he broadcast from Cuba, these were tools that we controlled, and it spread revolutionary ideas. It spread the truth about what was happening in terms of all of the racial oppression and attacks, and it exposed the U.S. hypocrisy, talking about fighting for democracy abroad, which was really about colonialism and imperialism, versus the terrorism that they sanctioned here in the United States against Black people, who, as we've talked about in these last couple of weeks, we built all of this. All of it was built on our backs with our labor and our genius. And then there is the international solidarity and anti-colonial struggle. And we see it still happening. And there's a lot of debate around it now. There are those who look at what's happening in Gaza and Palestine and say that's not our problem. And then there are those who look at that and say that's very much our problem. They are us and we are them. And, I won't give an opinion here, or I probably will eventually. But the bottom line, and I think this actually speaks for itself, the struggle, nobody is free until we all free. Now, how you enact and work with that is an individual choice on how you actually implement that. But understanding what happens to Black and Brown, the global South, oppressed people globally, especially now we're in a digital age, we're in this extremely global economy, which, again, as I've mentioned in these previous days and weeks, started or expanded with us. We were the global trade. They were going around getting all their little fixes, whether it was their sugar or their tobacco or their rum. But when it really started to take off was when they started stealing Black people, Africans, to work this land, to do all of these things, to support them, and actually to buy and sell us specifically. We became the actual global economy. We are the currency. We are the thing that gives all of this value. And understanding that on a global scale connects us to all of us globally. And that was part of what he started. And can I just say, I love this picture of him. He's looking at a FBI most wanted poster of himself with a little amused grin. That's how unbothered he was. That's how clear he was on why he was here and what he was doing, and the true actual power that he had. And also knowing that it was a complete lie. He hadn't kidnapped anybody. He helped save that white couple. He didn't kidnap them, and they never pressed charges, as we talked about earlier, but I digress. Let me keep it moving. And so the wisdom that we are left with, the wisdom that studying Robert F. Williams, studying him, understanding him, he teaches us that liberation requires both courage and action. We cannot be passive in the face of oppression. Oppression is at our door. We may feel like we're free because they have become masters at creating that illusion of freedom, creating that illusion that we have so much more than we've had before. And in some ways, sure, yes, we have more than generations before us had, but have more does not equal more freedom, does not equal more peace, does not equal more dignity, does not equal more clarity, does not equal liberation. We have to really understand what true liberation is, and it doesn't mean being able to go and Target and buy some shit. Because to be clear, what we learned yesterday with the Black Wall Street, the economy that they created with all of those 600 businesses in that 40 acres that Mr. Gurley bought and divided up and sold to other Black entrepreneurs, the economy they created made it so the Black dollar stayed in that environment, in that community, 36 times circulating before it ever left. I don't know if we have that now. We damn sure don't have it at 36 times something circulating within the Black community before we go spend money somewhere else. That just doesn't happen now. I'm just wondering, does it circulate 2 or 3 times at all? Or does every dollar that we make when we live in a Black community get spent outside the community? What our ancestors that we worked with in the previous week, the Sacred Shields, what they taught us is that the dollars have to circulate within our community in order to strengthen our community, in order to create economic sovereignty, which is a part of our liberation. And then Williams teaches us that that liberation requires us to be courageous and to actually act. That means we have to be willing to take risks for justice. He put his life on the line for Black people, and he proved that true revolution requires some sacrifice. That's a word that can be very familiar for those who practice African spiritual tradition. We're always talking about sacrificing a behavior or sacrificing something. He sacrificed his freedom, or his freedom in the United States, because he left in order to maintain his freedom. But he was willing to sacrifice himself for his people. That's how much he loved his people, how much he loved our own dignity. The wisdom he also left behind was that we needed to arm ourselves with knowledge and power. That's part of what this series is about. These are ancestors that I'm gonna keep it real. I maybe I heard their name. Quite a few of them I never heard their name, and I went and have 2 degrees from a historically Black college. Shout out Clark Atlanta University. And I don't blame them. I mean, there may have been times I was supposed to learn some things and I was out at Freaknik or something, but I'm just saying it's these ancestors, this work has been intentionally obscured from us, hidden from us. It's damn sure not going to be shared in the educational system. And if we ourselves don't know and teach our children, the information gets lost. So let's revitalize it. Arm yourself with knowledge. He was both a fighter and an intellectual. If you go back to that quote, he thought about this, he researched this, he'd had some critical thinking around this concept. He looked at what he had seen in other countries as a veteran. He looked at philosophies from other groups and to form his own philosophy and then acted. He was an intellectual as well as a fighter. He studied all these things and used it to fuel how he moved forward. It has to be both. And he challenged these ideas that actually erase Black resistance. We have to talk about his work in schools and community meetings and social spaces to ensure these lessons aren't lost. I'd never heard of this man in any of the Black um, the Black civil rights leaders that we've studied. Growing up, we had a big giant book called Great Negroes Past and Present. Anybody from my generation might remember that. It was the coffee table book in Black families. And I remember going through that book pretty regularly if I had to do a report for school or something or just flipping through it. This man was not in there. Only the comfortable, safe ones. And it's not to say what they did wasn't important and they weren't important, but they weren't the whole story. The non-violent resistors were not the whole story. The integrators were not the whole story. And we have to look at supporting Black-led safety initiatives and create Black-led safety initiatives, whether that means training both on the legal aspects of owning guns, owning weapons, training on how to use the weapons, and training on and even support for bail funds or legal support. We have to find ways to extend that vision into the present and find ways to again in ways that make sense for you, your life, your family, your environment, the skill sets that you have, but to not turn away from it, to have the courage to take the action and the intellect to research and understand and to build that knowledge. And then to build those bridges across global struggles. And, let's keep it 100 as always, because I don't even know any other way to be. The things that are happening globally, the things that are happening both, in Palestine and in countries across the world, much of what's happening is already being censored. There are protests, there are, I'll just say, things happening across the world in response to what's happening in the US, in response to what the US is doing or not doing in those countries. There are protests. There is a global movement happening that media and social media, traditional media and social media, are all blacking it out. This is why we have to look for other forms of information that is credible because a lot of people will come up with an idea and spread some misinformation. This is why the critical thinking, we talked about that earlier in the week with Octavia Butler, that critical thinking slash intuition, we got to tap into both of those. So when you get information, you can't just accept it as truth and run with it. You have to dissect it. You got to look at it from all the different angles. You got to tap into your higher self. You got to tap into your ancestors to really understand what is actually truth because we are being bombarded with a lot of lies these days. So we have to move forward and think about how do we know what's actually happening? How do we make those connections? How do we communicate? What are secure forms of communication? We need to think a little bit more militaristic. And I think I screwed that word up, but you get what I'm saying. We got to think strategically and in some cases be covert and in some cases be loud about it, like Robert F. Williams was. He used his being real public about his approach as a form of intimidation to help deter some of the white supremacist violence and murder that was happening. And we give thanks to him for that. We give thanks to Robert F. Williams. We give thanks to Mabel Williams, his wife, because together they did they did this work. He couldn't have done this work, as I talked about in some of the other slides. He couldn't have done this work without her support. She was his foundation. She was his rock. Her and his children. I tried to find out what happened. Both of his sons are now deceased, and there's not any information around grandchildren, and that is the way it should be. Let them be in peace, because the reality is they probably are still being under surveillance just because they're connected to him, they're related to him. So I'm glad I couldn't find anything. Maybe it's not as overt as it was before. But with that, again, we thank him for this work, and we thank him for the vision of another dimension that we need to think about in our approach to Black liberation. Again, if his approach, his philosophy was present in the early 1900s with the Black Wall Street, would they have been prepared for that coordinated attack that destroyed that community? Would they have been ready for it? Would it have even happened because those white mobs, those white law enforcement officers, those white National Guards who all came together to destroy and kill approximately 300 Black people in that town and destroy just about everything and loot whatever they could. It wasn't just about destroying, they stole. Would they have had the courage to do that if they knew they were going to be met with armed self-defense? These are things to think about. No one can tell you what you need to do or how you need to approach it. I'm offering the information, I'm offering the work that our ancestors did that we still live on today for you to integrate and to think about and to go further researching, tapping into the wisdom of your own ancestors, sacred lineage, expanding your base of resources, sacred shields, to go forth and understand what your version of sacred resistance looks like. So as I mentioned at the top of this session, rather than go into a guided meditation for each ancestor this week, the way we have done for the previous 14 days, because resistance is such a potentially energetically hot topic, I want to create a separate meditation that's a little longer than what we have been doing. So maybe it'll be 15 or 20 minutes. And I'm going to post that within the next 24 hours. And it'll be a meditation that is for this entire week. Because this week we're talking about some important things. We're talking about some difficult things. And again, things that can bring about really hot energy. And we want it to be cool because we need to think cool. And we don't want any mishaps to happen in the midst of that. So I'm going to dive in with that meditation and post that within the next 24 hours, and it'll encompass all of the different ways of resistance that we can embody this week, and that we'll talk about this week. But uh, the consistent thread through all of the ancestors that we're talking about this week is love and courage. Not one of them did things just because they wanted revenge or because they actually wanted to gain power over anyone else. Every last one of them stood on business for the love of their own people, and they had the courage to do so. So the meditation that I'll post will help us to tap into that for ourselves, because how we act on it, courage then action, well, love, courage, action in that order. How we act is going to be all individual. And I want you to have the space to be able to figure that out for yourself from a foundation of love and courage. So be on the lookout for that. That's why you got to ring the bell and click like and subscribe and all the things so that you know when new content is available, as well as when I go live, which we have, wow, we got 13 more days. That's a beautiful number. So we have the rest of this week with Sacred Resistance. Tomorrow, we're going to dive into two freedom fighters from two different time periods. Stokely Carmichael, who later renamed himself Kwame Ture, and the illustrious Tupac Shakur. Yes, he was a freedom fighter. And they had similar ways, similar approaches in that they use their voice, they use their words to fight resistance. I mean, there was some armed resistance in there as well, but their primary method of resistance was their voice. And so we're going to dive into them tomorrow. And then the rest of this week with our Sacred Resistance. And then our final week, week 4 of the Blackity Black History Month Ancestral Activation, will be Sacred Restoration. Because one thing is for sure, we as a people have been through so much. We have been through really would have been unsurvivable for anyone else. But we are a special people. And what we have survived and still stand and still create and still excel and still love is exceptional. But it's not without cost. It hasn't been without damage. It hasn't been without trauma. Even the best of us, those who think we are doing well and moving right along, those who are achieving things, no one escapes this trauma. It has moved through our bloodlines, both the wisdom and the beauty and the resiliency and all of the gifts and talents, which we talked about that in one of the days in our Sacred Lineage Week, the gifts and talents that we inherited from our relatives. We inherited those as well as the trauma of what they experienced and our own ongoing trauma because the racial oppression has not stopped. It's just changed flavors. So we have healing to do. And that final week, we'll tap into ancestors whose life work in different ways has been about the restoration of our people. That won't do it and complete, and you'll be healed and ready to go, but it can open you up to go further and to understand which aspects, if not all aspects, that you need to focus on in terms of helping yourself to heal. None of this is an easy journey, but we're here. We've chosen to be here in this life at this time. Show up and do the work. And with that, I'm not going to do a meditation, but I still got to end because that was just so much. We still had to end with some deep breaths because it was a lot to absorb and there's a lot for you to think about. So I just want you to take a few cleansing deep breaths in through your nose. Hold and exhale. Do that again. Take a deep inhale through your nose. Expand your lungs, front and back and sides. Let your whole body just become round with fresh air and oxygen. And hold it. And then release through your mouth, drawing in your belly, drawing up your diaphragm, pressing out all of that stale, stagnant air from deep in your lungs. And come back to normal, come back to center. And do that one more time. Inhale deeply, breathing in the wisdom, breathing in the peace, breathing in the calm, breathing in the love. Hold and let it saturate your body, let it saturate your mind. And exhale, relaxing your shoulders, giving it all to Mama Earth, who is always here supporting us. Let your shoulders drop, your jaw drop. I give you thanks, peace, and as always, until next time. take good care of you.